Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon from India and good morning for those of who are joining us from the west side of the world. Welcome to the 30th edition of Coffee with Ashish. And today, if I'm not wrong, Ashish, we've got our first international guest, and I'm personally very pleased and
Mhm.
privileged to welcome Patrick Richards onto our show. And before this session started, we were casually chatting, and Patrick mentioned that he drove to Spain. And I was just reading, and it is actually very cliched. I was doing some research for some project some time back, and I read that Spain is actually the number one destination for most of the Brits over even the last 5 decades, and they still managed to keep that number one spot. And even if you look at and Patrick, of course, once we get into his profile, will see and understand that how well he understands the entire European market and the UK market in particular. And I think UK market is extremely interesting if you see the evolution of especially the leisure travel. And I think Brit people actually, I was reading they spend up to 2 months of their annual, sort of salary onto holidays. And when I compare it to other parts of the world and even India, it stands, our spending stands minuscule in terms of how seriously people in the UK take their holidays. And in fact, if you see some of the amazing records which have been set by the Brit travelers, you would be amazed to hear the stories. Whether it's about one of the 24-year-olds who's the youngest to have traveled all the 196 countries in the world, or the cycling record famous which was set by again a British traveler. So I think it's an extremely interesting market, and we'll hear obviously more about it from Patrick. That as always I have couple of small cartoons to capture just the evolution of travel when it started with opening of duty free to people, trying, especially Brit travelers taking a call of whether to go to Switzerland for skiing or not if it's snowed a bit more in the UK. And I think these are some of the interesting snippets which I'm sure Patrick and his colleagues would have experienced both as a consumer as well as, when he was operating travel management companies. And Patrick, I think sort of two first. One is we have our first international guest today on the show, and second, I think he's also uh, by far one of the most experienced person to have on our show, who has got such a rich global exposure. Most of our guests have done something specific in one niche area of travel in a certain geography. But I think to have somebody who has got this plethora of experience across so many parts of travel, he looks young, but he's got over 35 years of experience behind him in travel industry, which is super amazing. And right from starting with Gulliver Travels Associate, fresh from his uni, which was a London-based wholesale tour operator. I think over 20 years he's sort of grown with the organization, and he also then sat on the same company's executive committee, and he was responsible for growing its group vertical. And I think by 2005 or so, the owners had sold the corporation to Sendon Corporation, and that's when he sort of transitioned when Blackstone's private equity had owned Travelport and merger with Tony had happened. And I think if I talk about recently, in last decade or so, he most recently in 2013, when he joined Cox and Kings, Patrick was their, first as their chief operating officer, and then slowly in 2015 he transitioned as the chief commercial officer for Cox and Kings. And during his tenure of 7 years or so, he actually modernized the distribution and purchasing across the group. And from 2017 onwards, he was then appointed the president of Cox and Kings Americas. As well, he was the sitting board director for the sister brand Easy Go One. Richards has always been a dedicated supporter of the travel and tourism fraternity and the entire ecosystem as a whole, not only in the UK, but essentially across the world. And, he is also in the last few years, and I know personally that he has been very active in the startup world. He's a strong advocate of reinvention and future prosperity of the tourism business. And his time currently is split between supporting his startup portfolio, to whom he mentors personally and gives them advice. And he's also on boards of a lot of companies, and he does board advisory role for them. And he's also a very passionate believer that successful commercial strategies for global growth would come through collaborative action. And he's also very passionate about global sustainability initiatives in travel and tourism, and also harnessing the power of technology and digital transformation to take the next big leap. So with this, a very warm welcome to you, Patrick, and namaste from all of us here in India. And we are so honored and privileged to have you join this conversation with us. And I'm going to hand over now to Ashish to have a conversation with you while I sit back and enjoy my coffee.
Right. So Patrick, my coffee and your tea.
Yeah, English tea. Sorry to break the tradition, but I feel I'm in keeping with my nationality.
Right. So having said that, Patrick, you've actually been involved with the Indian market, I believe, since the 1980s. And you've particularly seen how the outbound holiday market in India has grown. And so I just want you to trace the evolution of the outbound holiday piece, and how do you see it now going forward post-COVID? Just as a general sense to people who are pretty disappointed as to what's happening in the industry now.
Well, firstly, thank you, Ashish, and thank you, Kartik, for the great introduction, and hello to everybody out there who's watching, and thanks for joining. And I'm honoured to be the first international guest. So, look, I think there's two questions. One is recollections, and one is evolution.
Right.
The recollections part, I have very fond, slightly romantic recollections of those early pioneering days in the 1980s, because the Indian outbound industry was just taking off, and I was a young professional wanting to prove myself within GTA in 1985, and the industry was really in its formative stages coming out of India. Many of the issues were actually very similar to the ones today, but they were magnified. It was to do with visas, feeding people the way they wanted to be fed, meeting the price points that could stimulate sales, and making sure that the flow of money and everybody got paid. And they were probably the biggest ones. From the food side, of course, it was the evolution or the start of the food trucks, which used to follow the coaches around Europe, feeding them, which we always had great fun about. Sometimes they stopped in somewhat inappropriate places, like major roundabouts in the middle of Paris, which might not always have been to the satisfaction of the local police. So, there were all things like this that were going on. CETA was an institutionally fabulous client and valued client of ours, and we had a few. We also had a few who were less reliable, and of course, as all of the business was groups, the invoice amounts were quite substantial, and the payments back then were by airline MCO.
Yeah.
So when the groups arrived, we'd always hope that the tour leaders would bring an MCO with them, and we sat on tenterhooks, and very often they would come in very smiling and present us with gifts of mangoes, but no MCOs. And that was always a moment of panic, because mangoes weren't a very good exchange for MCOs, unfortunately. So there were all sorts of things like that. I was two of the early pioneers, I think, from the Indian industry were Prakash and Vikamsi.
That's right.
And they would run trade fair visits to Europe, notably to Germany, to some of the trade fairs in Germany. That's right. During those stages, the German hotels in Düsseldorf or in Hanover were extraordinarily expensive during the period of the trade show. So what we would do is we would put them up in private accommodation. And I was, as a young guy, sent over to coordinate a lot of these operations, which was always quite interesting, having 500 guys from Delhi and Mumbai and various different areas arriving in Germany. And I remember once, after taking a group out after a late dinner, they just checked in, and we had 40 accommodation cards and 38 customers, and we drove around, and due to the late hour, there were a few refusals. So after about an hour, we found that we had 28 accommodation cards and 33 customers. So we suddenly had to think on our feet about how to accommodate these guys driving around Hanover for half the night. It must be said the customers took it all in incredibly good spirits, telling jokes and singing Indian songs and drinking a little bit of whiskey in the back of the coach. So they were all great experiences. And I remember a few years later sitting on a panel with where Prakash was the moderator, and I'd prepared quite a serious talk about the challenges for Indian customers and European service providers in Europe. And Prakash introduced me by saying, "Here's Mr. Patrick Richards. We've had many a time together, and he's going to tell you about all the funny things that happen to Indians in Europe." Rather threw me, because I suddenly thought, my gosh, I'm the comedy act. So I had to think on my feet on that one. So really, you know, great times, and there was never a dull moment in those early days. As to evolution, I think you can see the industry growing, with a huge turning point coming in 98, 99, when the currency restrictions restricting the outbound amounts to $839 were lifted by the Indian government. And there you saw an explosion within the Indian industry, especially with businesses like SOTC and Cox and Kings coming to the fore and really growing their passenger numbers both to Asia and to Europe. There were certain European companies who tried to penetrate the market, like TUI and Quoni, who of course bought SOTC. But I think that they found operating in the Indian market with complexities that are quite unique to India, quite difficult to handle. So therefore, a lot of Indian companies have really been the ones that have won out in this race. And of course, that's added to by the development of the OTA sector and businesses like Make My Trip that have delivered and brought on board a lot of passengers, although also they've struggled to be able to maintain profitability within their operations.
Right.
So, you know, India's evolved massively, and as we then see, of course, all of the NTOs have really been able to value, you know, from maybe if you go back to the 80s, there was some suspicion of the Indian tourism industry, but of course now it's valued as a huge potential market. And back in the 1990s, for example, the three key source markets for Dubai were the UK, Russia, and Germany. Well, now India is the number one source market. And, you know, that's also then permeated into Asia and many other areas. Another evolution I think I would see is just the sheer diversification of the market. And if you think about it logically, if you're traveling as a first-time traveler, which many were in 98, 99 when the market opened up, you wanted to see as many countries as possible. So the 6-country and 8-day tour of Europe was very common. If you've now been traveling for 20 years, you've become much more sophisticated, and your kids have become much more sophisticated. So now we see Indians who are hiking in Patagonia, whiskey drinking in Scotland, on the wine routes in Spain, where I am. So that terrific diversification of the Indian market, I think, has also been very attractive for a lot of the NTOs. Right. So for example, we have worked very closely with Visit Britain over a number of years in building their presence here in India. And I noted a recent survey from VFS, which showed that the UK was the second only to Dubai in aspirational destinations for Indians to travel to post-COVID. So that was an interesting. And I think as COVID lifts, let's face it, there's going to be a lot of hotel chains who have thousands of properties and are running at 30% occupancy. Similarly, there's going to be a lot of cruise companies who've got empty ships. So for the outbound Indian market, as it's going to grow, and I think, you know, if the Indian market even begins to track the growth of the Chinese market, which had 4.5 million outbound visitors in 2000 and now has 150 million outbound visitors,
right.
India currently has 26. I don't think it's unreasonable, even with COVID and all of the problems, to think that the Indian market will grow to 70 million outbound visits by the end of the decade. Yeah. So, you know, there'll be plenty of Indian tourists who can get some great deals, frankly, from all of those hotel chains and all of those cruise ships who will want their business. So, you know, I think that really bodes well for the future of the Indian outbound market.
Yeah. I trust a Brit and an Indian to be having a chat and not talk about cricket. Let me tell you, the latest thing on Dubai is that they are planning to host the IPL, the Indian Premier League, in Dubai this time. Towards the end of the year. So you might actually have an international IPL instead of just an Indian Premier League.
We can talk a lot about cricket. We beat the West Indies yesterday, so we're happy about cricket this morning.
Yeah, that's correct. So now let's just switch gears and come to inbound India, which has been under a great debate in various ministries, forums, of not only how it will get back into shape in the future, or why it's not been in shape. And you were president of Cox and Kings Americas, and that gave you a tremendous insight into source market, international source markets, inbound markets. I mean, what is it you really think about India as an inbound destination? Not only a little bit of the past, but going forward.
Well, you know, firstly, let's put this into perspective. Our old chairman of Cox and Kings had been to India 478 times. I don't think I had any chance of catching up with him. But I've certainly been to India over 60 times in my life. So I'm a huge fan of India, as will be obvious. But inbound, I think we've got to be frank, with only 10.7 million visitors annually, India underpunches its weight. Put this into perspective, Amsterdam alone has more than double those number of tourists annually, and even little old Venice is also has double those number of people. Within an Asian context, I think India ranks 7th amongst APAC countries for inbound tourism, with 5% of the market share. Right. So I think India can do, frankly, a lot more. And if I look at it, to your point, from the American perspective, a lot of Americans saw India as a kind of what we would describe in the UK as a Marmite destination, either love it or hate it. So there would be real India addicts who'd been 6 or 7 times and love the country like I do. But for all of those people, there'd be another 5 who were a bit fearful of coming to the country because of the crowds, fears of food poisoning, whatever those things might be. So I think there's a real opportunity for India to both attract the first-time visitor and get some more repeat visitors going forward. And I talked a little bit earlier about the cruise industry, and I'm going to just zone in on the cruise industry. I think government could do a lot to develop infrastructure in this post-COVID world. India currently has 3 and a bit ports that can really take cruise ships. And again, you know, despite its problems that the cruise industry is having at the moment, the well-publicized problems, it's an industry that's grown enormously in the last 10, 20 years. And if you look, I think in 2018, India had 140 port visits. Compare that to Japan, which has over 3,000 port visits. So India doesn't even sit in the top 10 of Asian destinations for the cruise companies. Now, India has, 3,000 miles of beautiful coastline?
Right, sure.
It should be there. During the period of October to March, all of the cruise companies want to move their boats outside of the northern hemisphere and take them down to the southern hemisphere. India should be, in my view, an ideal destination for those cruise ports, for those cruise ships to berth at. But currently, it's underpunching its weight. And you know, if you talk to the operational guys at Carnival or Royal Caribbean, they'll say they find India a very difficult destination to be able to work with, and that's because of some of the bureaucracy, or for example, Mumbai, they've only just opened a dedicated cruise terminal, and hitherto the customers were having to get up on board with iron ore and chemical ships coming in and offloading, you know, industrial goods, which isn't a great look. So I think there's so much more that India could do in this area. And you know, people might look at it as, well, that's the first time traveller. But at Cox and Kings, we work very closely with Azamara, and Azamara developed really interesting programs where they take the customer off the ship and do 2 to 5 overnights inland, and that's a fantastic way of introducing a first, second, third time traveller to new areas within India. As to first-time products, we developed quite a few interesting first-time products within, you know, over the last few years, both from the Australian market and from the American market, where we just worked very hard, even though it might be low season, to get the price point right. And hey, guess what? You know, we had, not only we generated a lot of passengers, we also had great customer satisfaction ratings. So if you get the product right, you can develop customers. And I think there's ways in which there are certain post-COVID trends that are playing very well for India. Certainly in the West, there's a huge emphasis right now on mental well-being. If I'd have talked to a UK or European businessman a few years ago, none of them would have admitted to meditating. That would have been a sign of weakness. Now every other guy I speak to is meditating like crazy. Now, India is the global home of meditation. This is a trend that can really play well to India's inbound tourism. Similarly, I would say something like CSR. You know, luxury tourism has moved through 3 phases. It was a well-coined phrase: from consumption to immersion to conversion. And the immersion, of course, is immersion in local communities. Moving to the conversion, it's people who want to travel to a destination and leave feeling like they've made a difference, feeling like they've contributed something to the local. And you know, clearly that's going to play well to India in the future. And we also need to find ways to get people to diversify away from the Golden Triangle. And you know, in the United States, the Golden Triangle was the first, the second, and the third yes. Destination. Now, I refer the audience to an article in Bloomberg a few years ago, which talked about the 7 wonders of the world. And it effectively said, look, the 7 wonders of the world, everyone's been to see them now. There's a new 7 wonders of the world that people really need to see. And top of that list was the temple complex in Hampi. You know, so what a great introduction to develop a new star of Indian tourism. But that, you know, that's an incredible complex that will play well. And of course, you also have the Indian railways, which really can grow the connectivity and grow FIT travel. Plus, it's sustainable. These are all very good things that fit in with the way that travel is developing in the coming years.
Right. So, you know, talking about cruise terminal, here's a little secret. In the mid-90s, when I set up P&O Travel in India, and I was handling a huge Princess cruise vessel in Cochin. As part of the standard operating procedure, obviously the whole team reported there 4 hours before the vessel was meant to arrive. And to my amazement, I see a huge block of coal being exactly where the vessel should have been, because something came last night, a night before, and dumped the coal and went away. And there we were, you know, trying to move it, sweep off. And, you know, that's how cruises were handled in India, at least in the mid-90s. I don't know if it's evolved. But yeah, I agree with you. I think there needs to be investments into better terminals coming in. It's a way to it, because India can be an exceptional cruise destination for sure.
I also agree. I think you had Deepak Deva on your show, Ashish, and he made the point about the evolution of the DMO from a destination marketing organization to a destination management organization.
Right.
And part of that long-term planning of bringing in collaboration, I think the DMOs really need to raise their game to be able to lobby governments, to be able to reconcile, to bring together the industry and move forward on a strategic plan.
Right, that's correct. The other day, you and I were having a chat on the Buzz platform. And you know, something which has amazed me, and maybe you can throw some light on it. I've always believed, maybe because I sit in India and I look at it from an Indian perspective, that the Indian technologies companies, be it Infosys, SCL, Wipro, are just top-class international companies. But still, the evolution of technology as far as Indian travel sphere is concerned hasn't moved in the manner it should have been. I mean, what are your thoughts and insight about India and technology and moving forward?
I think Indian technology, I agree with you, is fantastic. I'm just not so sure it's fantastic in the travel arena.
Yeah.
But actually, Ashish, you could say the same for technology generally. We had Greg Land, who is the head of global tourism for IBM, on a session recently. So he has 9,000 staff under him working in the tourism business. I asked him to mark tourism's homework, and he said, I give you a generous 6.5. And he said, far too often tourism companies jump to offline manual solutions. And if I go back to India, I remember from my early days walking into offices where I'd see rows and rows and rows of human beings. And it speaks to an extremely labor-intensive approach. And I think in these days, we have to be able to adopt technology. And I understand the instinct of owners to be able to protect their employees and protect jobs, which especially in India is very important. But the overall health of the company means people want technology. Consumers expect technology. And if they've been in the retail segments and had a great experience, when they put their hat on to buy travel, they expect the same experience, and too often they don't get it. And back to Greg Land, he said, well, travel has a lot to learn from fintech and medtech and all of these other areas which are steaming ahead with their technology. So particularly with travel, I think there's a problem with the back end. A lot of people work very, very hard to make the initial customer experience good. But when you get into the back end of the plumbing of travel, there's still huge manual intervention. And that particularly tells when you have a crisis like COVID and you have to be able to track customers and relocate them and do a lot of logistical stuff, that infrastructure breaks down. And I think that's been really found wanting during COVID, if you like. So there needs to be more put in as there. I think another point I'd like to make would be just concerning the way that SaaS is viewed, the consensus in India. And clearly there are a lot of smart people programming and writing code in India. My advice would be to be a little less prescriptive. And the way that they're viewed from the outside is, they do what you ask them to do, and there's not enough questioning. And I think as they become less, they should become less deferential and ask more questions as to, why are you doing it this way? Why don't you consider to do it that way? Yeah. And I think that really involves a cultural change within India. And interestingly, when I was at Cox and Kings, I saw this up firsthand. That a lot of the staff in Cox and Kings were pretty conservative. They were slightly older, and they were very deferential. When I flipped across and put my EasyGo One hat on, which was the online side, there were young, feisty kids who were out there and were prepared to question and put their opinions forward. And I think for the development of Indian SaaS technology, it would be absolutely right that you follow that more questioning, feisty approach. There's 600 million young people in India, and let's see those changes. I think that'll take Indian technology forward in a very good way.
No, I'll take your bit on the younger people in India and your opinion and advice to them. Remember, Jan did call us two old dogs when we got onto the bus platform. So perhaps let's hear it from one old dog, or what you advise the youngsters in India. They're pretty disgruntled lot, disappointed lot, jobs the way they have been. I think there's hope for them still.
Education, education, education.
Right.
I get it. You know, none of us, even old dogs like us, we're not too old to get an education, Ashish. And certainly during lockdown, I looked at a certain number of areas where I felt I needed to upskill myself. And I used those hours during lockdown to read, to learn, to look at webinars constantly. And that's really helped me in this period. I think if you look at India, I think it's, you may correct me on these stats, but I think 2.3% of Indians get a formal education. And if you look at South Korea, that's 96%. Now, they used to say that you'd need to build 1,000 universities and 50,000 technical colleges in order to cater for that. I believe that online education is a game changer. And now people have online education capabilities at their fingertips. So I would really encourage everybody to go out and upskill yourself, know more. When I started at GTA, I was, back to the old days, I was very embarrassed in one of my early customer meetings because the customer asked me about the hotels, and as a young guy, I didn't know these hotels in Europe. So I made it my business over the next 4 years to go to every city in Europe and learn, or every major city, and learn about every hotel so I could speak about them authoritatively. And even within the people in the tourism business now, I'd put a challenge out to them to say, do your frontline staff really know the cities? Do they really know the hotels? Do they really know what's on offer? Do they really know the logistical hurdles that you might face? All of those are so important in being able to sell and being able to give a good service to a clientele who's becoming increasingly sophisticated. So education, education, education. The other thing I think I would say is and it really relates to our work on the Startup Mentoring Board, is just believe in yourselves. You know, I think India, I admire India massively for its ingenuity, for its ability to go for it. I always used to say to my staff in the UK, when they'd complain, they'd say, but this is my job. Somebody's done my job. I said, well, you know, were you doing it? Were you waiting for somebody else to do it? Because in India, if there's road space, look at the driving. If there's road space, somebody will be in there.
Somebody will, yeah.
And that's the Indian mentality, and that's a great asset to have. So I would encourage that. You know, when crisis hits, there's always room for new businesses to grow. And if old dogs like you and I can give a little bit of advice to those new companies as they grow, then all the better, because it's a calling for us at our age to be able to give something back.
Right. So I'll move you back to the youngster and somebody in the education line, and that's Karthik, to conclude. And enjoy your stay in Spain while you're there, Patrick.
Thank you so much.
And I'll catch up with you again.
Thank you so much, Ashish. Thank you, Karthik.
Over to Karthik.
Yeah, hi. So we have got one question, and just to on that data point you mentioned about formal education. So in India, the gross enrollment ratio is close to 98%, which means people enter a lot in primary school, but the graduation from primary school into senior secondary and college is where the percentage drops significantly. So on education front.
Sure.
So we've got one question from Solomon Malachi, if I pronounce it correctly. So the person is into hospitality, based in Europe, but is a Nigerian. And he wanted your advice that, you know, what could be done to boost tourism business in Nigeria, if you have any thoughts.
To boost inbound tourism business into Nigeria?
Or general tourism business in Nigeria, not specifying inbound or outbound. But I'm assuming both, not purely inbound.
I think there's obviously Nigeria has a very large population, and there's a lot of wealth there. So, you know, there are, as in the same way that businesses have been out to a lot of the Middle Eastern markets and really developed them over the years, I would say, reach out to Western businesses, reach out both for inbound tourism and outbound tourism, and make sure the product is something that's going to make sure that if one person goes and enjoys it, that somebody else will come back. There's a lot of parts of Nigeria, from my experience, that are pretty expensive. So it needs also to be a product that's good value for money for visitors. So they would be some of the pointers that I would give.
Yeah. Just to add to my friend from Nigeria, I was reading up, India is of course number 2 destination after China in terms of internet growth. And of course there's Indonesia at number 6 and 7. And to my surprise, I saw Nigeria at number 9. So I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of internet penetration and growth related to travel.
Yes, so I think this was the other points we've already covered. And any parting message? Okay, we have got one more question if you have time, Patrick. Sandeep Dayal is asking that, Patrick, I loved every point of yours and having worked closely with you. So probably you know this gentleman, Sandeep Dayal.
Thank you, Sandeep.
Sandeep,
Great to hear from you.
Sandeep is another old dog, yeah.
So yeah,
but a very youthful looking old dog.
Yeah.
And he's saying that you should seriously consider to hold online classes as education for young aspirants in the industry. And I second him, you should. So thank you so much. And I was saying, any parting message for young entrepreneurs or people who are just thinking to start up in these times? Do you have any final message for them, Patrick?
Know your product. Know your product inside out. Do your homework on your market. Do more homework than you could ever think was possible on who your competitors might be, what the size of the market might be, all of those things. And then have belief in yourself and be prepared to pivot, because undoubtedly what you start out doing will probably not be what you finish up doing.
So true. So with this, we are at the end of this session. Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing time with us. And thanks, Ashish, for hosting as always. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. And we hope to see you in our next session on Thursday.
Oh, which is tomorrow.
Which is tomorrow with Rajesh Mago of MakeMyTrip.com. That's going to be again, it's going to be in the morning, 11:30. So that's a bit of a change. But we'll send the reminder on our Facebook page as well.
Right.
Thanks
Ashish.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.